If a black man was saying this today on a podcast, would this be a hotep? Would James Baldwin be a hotep today? This is the point of my research where I started to get lightheaded because I was like, are you fucking kidding me, Baldwin? You're saying that.
And tonight on Soul, part 2 of a conversation between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni.
I've been waiting so long to make this video for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it is because this is such an interesting topic and I haven't really seen a black man break this down. Whether or not James Baldwin was misogynist, whether or not he relied on misogynoir, whether or not he was complicit in it. And thank you to everyone that's been watching my videos lately. I did a How Hollywood Broke James Baldwin video, breaking down James Baldwin's relationship with Malcolm X. So to set the stage, the year is 1971, James Baldwin is 47 years old, and Nikki Giovanni is 28 years old. And for those that don't know, James Baldwin is a famed writer that was born in 1924, went to Paris in 1948, and would go on to write other famed works like Notes of a Native Son, Giovanni's Room, Another Country, among many more. Nikki Giovanni, born in 1943, is an influential African-American poet, writer, activist, and educator. Emerging from the Black arts movement, her bold and authentic voice explores themes of race, gender, and social justice. Giovanni advocates for racial equality and women's rights. Giovanni's impact on literature and activism is profound, inspiring readers worldwide. And this conversation is very interesting because it comes at a time where the civil rights movement has kind of faded out a little bit. The Black Power movement has been happening for a few years, but it's been happening long enough for there to be some criticism and some skepticism around this notion of hypermilitancy and Black nationalism. And this conversation seems to be at the intersection of both of these things.
I know that a great deal of what passes for Black militancy right now is nothing but a fashion.
At best.
At best.
Nikki Giovanni is a Black queer woman. James Baldwin is a Black queer man. And they're both talking about gender and their approaches to gender and their approaches to revolution and accountability, but from very different standpoints. And so it was interesting to watch this video, which had inspired me so much a few years ago among James Baldwin's other speeches, and then to see it now. Oh, I cringed a lot more than I expected. And it just reminded me the importance of revisiting media that has mattered to you a lot in the past. And this isn't to say that this rewatch made me hate Baldwin and I don't like this conversation, but I do think this conversation is a very interesting and real model as to how Black men and women or Black people come together to talk about gender and the various obstacles in communication that can come up. But I do know if I were in the room with them and watching them both talk, I would have sided with Nikki Giovanni. And here's why. So before we get into this discussion, I want to break down a few basic terms that are going to help us orient this conversation because it's really important. And the first, what is misogyny and what is misogynoir? Misogyny is referred to as the hatred, dislike, or prejudice against girls or women. It is rooted in patriarchal beliefs and systems that devalue women and reinforce gender-based inequalities. Misogyny can manifest in various forms, including discrimination, violence, objectification, belittlement of women's experiences, voices, and contribution. This is kind of a base term that hatred and lack of understanding and violence towards all women. The reason that the term misogynoir came into play is because the white feminism of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s may have demanded for women's rights or the white woman's right to vote, but it usually locked out Black women.
Misogynoir, the hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against Black women. In 2008, while I was writing my dissertation, I coined the term misogynoir, and it was a term that I was really trying to find because I wanted to talk about something I was seeing in these dated medical school yearbooks in terms of how Black women were represented. And unfortunately, that representation matched things that I was seeing in a lot of the different media innovations.
Civil rights movement, there were so many men that said, we need to defend Black men, and when Black women, you have to sit down, you have to wait your turn, because if Black men are strong, then Black women can be strong. It's the same kind of logic that the white feminist movement pushed for when it said, white women need to have their rights first and Black women need to sit down. There's always a hierarchy of progress that is also in line with a racial or socio-political hierarchy, which is why it's important to define these terms to understand the different particularities of violence that different populations experience. White women can still benefit from white supremacy, although they are subjected to the evils of the patriarchy. Black women are subjected to both systemic racism and the evils of the patriarchy at both white people and Black men. And I think this is an interesting thing that they dive into in this discussion between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin, that Baldwin struggles to really understand. I do think it is important to name these things and figure out how the past shows us signifiers of why these terms exist. And these terms were, and I think on either side, whether we look at the nonviolent strategy or we look at the Black Power movement kind of strategy, we can see traces of misogynoir and a sort of disregard for Black women's experiences and their safety throughout. But in the 1960s, we can look at misogynoir in a number of ways. Black women faced gendered expectations within the movements, being often relegated to supportive roles such as secretarial work or providing food. And we can see this in the Black Panther Party, how so many women were expected to do childcare, how so many women were expected to be a part of the survival programs.
My school was started by the Black Panther Party. The earliest age you can start going to this school is when you're 2.
You say, si quiero.
They put us in different levels based on what we can do.
¿Te gusta? ¿Te gusta?
Schools, everything was a problem. For example, they used to serve cookies and I think graham crackers and milk in the morning to children in primary school who had the money to pay for it. And if you didn't have the money to pay for it, you had to put your head on the desk until the other kids finished eating.
My school served us breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
I did an episode of my podcast called The Dugout where we watched Judas and the Black Messiah, which is a biopic depiction of the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was a part of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. And there's a particular scene where the FBI informant is sitting in on a Black Panther Party class and he's trying to like talk to this girl. And the teacher says like, you're not supposed to you're not supposed to hit on girls in the party. Like this is a rule. So these gendered expectations were so established in the party that some branches and chapters of the Black Panther Party had rules about how to get these Black militant men to keep their PPs in their pants. So misogynoir is very much entangled in the 1960s, and come 1971, this discussion occurs between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin on a national broad. A big part of their conversation is about racialization, it's about gender, and they dive into violence and kind of the permissions that the patriarchy offered to men versus women. Because I found this discussion to be so fucking interesting.
If the man's sexuality is gone, then his possibility, his hope of loving is also gone. You know,
he has no way to express. He has limited ways to express.
He has absolutely no floor on which to dance, no room in which to move, no way to get from one day to the next.
You know what I mean? That once again, the Black man is the figure that you say, well, I can't handle that. And if you visit with the states or you talk to people enough, you'll see that same syndrome. The little guys that are standing around crossing their arms and they're not lovable. They're not giving any love. They could give a damn about me. You know what I mean? And that's unfortunate because I need love.
Yes, but sweetheart, what you're saying is very, very serious. I'm not in the least denying it, because you're perfectly right. But the only way we can get through it, I think, is demanding a great deal of you.
And Black men refuse to function like that because they say, I want to bring the crib when I come.
Baby,
you're never going to get the crib.
Baby.
Bring yourself.
Baby, I agree with you. I understand what you're saying, But let me tell you this, you may be absolutely right, and you are right from your point of view.
It's arbitrary.
But you have to understand my point.
But I think a part of putting an end to James Baldwin nostalgia, very telling when you read James Baldwin's body of work, the treatment of women versus men. There are a lot of reasons for this.
You see, if it seems to me that the Black male, situation of the Black male is in microcosm, the situation of the Christian world. The price of being a Black man in America, God bless you.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
It's the weather.
The price you had to pay the price you're expected to pay, and which you have to outwit, is your sex. A black man is forbidden by definition since he's black.
See, okay, this is at 32 minutes into the conversation, and already. This is so difficult for me to stomach, because as a cisgender dude right now in this current world, if I show up into spaces and I'm like, black men have to overcome their sex, if a black man was saying this today on a podcast, would this be a hotep? Would James Baldwin be a hotep today? And the reason this is interesting is because immediately in this conversation, when they begin to dive into gender, you can see that Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin are entering gender from very different realms. James Baldwin is entering gender from this realm where he is buying into this intrinsic idea that men operate to uphold the family, men operate as caregivers, men operate as providers. And what he speaks to is the fact that black men cannot survive their sex. In a white supremacist and patriarchal society, they are subjected to racism and they're subjected to their emasculization. And this is a big, big talking point for a lot of black men that veer near conservatism, because it becomes necessary for them to say that in order for the black community to have a better world, life, etc., there needs to be certain values that are upheld. But white supremacy, colonization, is the intervention on these values. And I don't think this is exactly what Baldwin is purporting, but I think his line of logic be folded into this messier depiction of what gender dynamics are and why men in their rage matters more. And what essentially Baldwin digs into a lot in this discussion is saying that when black men go out into the world, they're treated poorly by police officers, they're treated poorly by their bosses, they experience segregation, and all of this takes away their sex, it takes away their power. As Baldwin says at one point,
if a man's sexuality is gone, then his possibility, his hope of loving is also gone. You know,
he has no way to express. He has limited ways to express.
He has absolutely no floor on which to dance, no room in which to move, no way to get from one day to the next.
When a black man experiences all of this subjugation, all of this degradation, all of this emasculization, he returns home, and what will he do? Of course he's going to flip out. As Baldwin says, this rage has to come out somewhere. So why not the family? Why not your wife and kids? Baldwin's exploration of masculine rage is tied very specifically to his experiences with his stepfather, who berated Baldwin all the time, who told him that he was ugly, but they became closer through their experiences in the church. And as Baldwin came of age,
I had to watch my father and what my father had to endure to raise 9 children on $27.50 a week when he was working. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't know what the man was going through at all. I didn't know why, he was always in a rage. I didn't know why he was impossible to live with. But I had not had to go through yet his working day. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't quit his job because he had the kids to feed. He couldn't say, as our kids can, I don't like white people. He couldn't say anything. He lived his whole life in silence, except in the church.
If you read Notes of a Native Son, there is a very beautiful section of it where Baldwin writes about Baldwin's father passed away in 1943 when Baldwin was 19 years old. And for anyone that has lost a parent at a young age, it can become a very pivotal moment in your life. And you can see the traces of this grief and darkness and sadness throughout Baldwin's work. At one point in the conversation later on, Baldwin says, I can understand it. I don't know if it happens to a woman, but I know it happens to a man. I cannot do anything. They've got you. They got you by the throat and by the balls. And of course, it comes out. So what Baldwin is asserting is the necessity for black men to express their rage in an unjust society. And what Baldwin is also speaking to is the reality that black men often exert their rage against the people closest to them, against their children, against their partners, and how this is a cyclical part of how black men work through the violence of living through a capitalist, racist society. And it's interesting that throughout this conversation, there's this notion of this irremovability of gender. So much of Baldwin's work and kind of ethos is about absolving these identities, these racializations that separate us, and instead turning towards a more deeper kind of humanism. Maybe the 60s changed Baldwin in a way that made him approach the 70s differently in terms of gender and identity. Maybe the humanistic Baldwin of the 60s, who mattered more to the white liberals and could be the great white hope to so many people, saw those great white hopes dashed by the assassinations of MLK, Medgar Evers, and Malcolm X. And now Baldwin is turning more towards his community to find these answers, to search Blackness, to defend Blackness, to understand the Black male experience. And you can see this in the writings that he does, especially in the 70s, or maybe it's the 80s, like The Devil's Finds Work, or I believe it's No Name in the Street, or Just Above My Head. But you can see in these later works that Baldwin is contending more seriously with gender, but it still isn't gender that is very much tied to an ethic around Black women and Black feminism. And I think this is a part of the problem, because if Baldwin can argue that we need to remove these illusions and masks in order to be a better society or be a better individual in the face of what America or what our culture needs, why does he not extend this same kind of expansion, this same kind of desire for dignity to Black women who are the people holding up the community, who are the people running these survival programs and doing all of the kind of behind the scenes work that the frontliners and the more militant and revolutionary, and I'm gonna hold a gun kind of Black men don't want to do as much. It's so easy for Baldwin to kind of ignore the untold labor of Black women. And Nikki Giovanni is smart in her response, because she starts to try to rebuke by saying, those weren't your kids, those were your parents' kids. Like, you have your own life, you have your own responsibilities. You can't take responsibility for something that you didn't produce. Baldwin is defending the irrationality of gender, when in other parts of his life, he will not defend the irrationality of colonization or white supremacy or patriotism or McCarthyism or anti-poorness. So why is he willing to defend this sort of irremovability of gender? And it begs the question of, is Baldwin defending these notions of gender because on some level he benefits from them? Because on some level he is trying to use these notions of gender to connect with the Black community, to connect with the Black male experience, after having been pushed out of so many spaces and movements in a variety of ways. Baldwin's kind of refusal to look at the complexity of gender and misogynoir, how it might relate to his refusal to kind of align with or assert himself very clearly as a queer or bisexual man. But there are interviews where he talks about being gay, and so the language is different because it's a different time period.
Coming out as a writer, you are a Black, impoverished homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
Baldwin's desire to align himself with kind of cis Black politics, I think it's just a signifier of the time. I mean, you can even see it throughout. I think there's a really famous James Baldwin speech where he says, like, where he's talking to someone, he's like, you expect me to sacrifice my woman, my child, my home, as a feminist, as a queer man, and as a cis Black man, because I think Baldwin, he could have done more. I'm like, why could you have just listened to Nikki Giovanni more? Like, he was cutting her off so much in this fucking conversation. So over a decade later, in 1984, James Baldwin ended up having a discussion with the famed Black feminist poet Audre Lorde. In this article, it says, Lorde and Baldwin also mirror each other in their arguments that women and men's experiences are different. Lorde argues that Black women not only have been denied the American dream, but have never been written into the American nightmare. Even worse than the nightmare is the blank, Lorde says, and Black women are the blank. Nobody was even studying me except as something to wipe out. Baldwin, for his part, insists that Black men have a special signification or status in terms of racial and gender oppression. Rather than a blank, the Black man is a marked man, a target of the state. A Black man has a prick, they hack it off. A Black man is a nigger when he tries to be a model for his children and he tries to protect his woman. So once again, you can see here Baldwin's reliance on a Black man, his woman. I think this is very much kind of, to me, the first signifiers when I was reading his work and taking his work, about his reliance on certain patriarchal kind of ideologies or certain heterocentrisms. The speaker's agreement about gender as different quickly produces, however, a reoccurring tension in the conversation about where the revolution indicated in the title needs to occur. And Lorde diverge when they try, as Baldwin says, they must, to locate where the danger is. He orients the root of the oppression and thus the danger in the white Western world. Baldwin's macroscopic view, however, becomes a skewed optic that by privileging the danger for Black men, recreates Black women as the blame. Then the piece goes on to say, time and time again, Baldwin reiterates a vision of his question to Lorde. But don't you realize that in this republic, the only real crime is to be a Black man? Lorde denies that formulation of oppression, again, arguing, no, I don't realize that. I realize the only crime is to be Black, and that includes me too. Lorde locates the danger not only across the racial difference, but also the gender difference, noting that Black men and Black women are both vulnerable, but differently so. While she claims that the boot is on both of their necks, Lorde argues that the Black woman's blood is flowing at the hands of a Black man. But my blood will not wash out your horror, she insists. In predicting the inevitability of Black women cleaving your heads open with axes, Lorde warns that Black men and boys must address. In response, Baldwin accuses Lorde of blaming the Black man for the trap he's in, insisting that though his violent actions toward Black women are his responsibility, they are not his fault. It's not him who is my enemy, Baldwin contends. Even when he beats up his grandmother has got to know. While Baldwin seems to take Lorde's point about the potential for mutual destruction between Black men and women, he cannot but see the Black man as the protector of his women and children, even when he violently transfers his pain onto their bodies. This is wild to me. And when he beats up his grandmother has got to know. This is the point in my research where I started to get lightheaded because I was like, are you fucking kidding me, Baldwin? You're saying that. It literally makes sense when you read Baldwin's work because so much of his work is about men exerting their rage onto women, women being periphery characters or women being vessels for intrinsic love or healing. So I'm talking like, especially another country. Yeah, I think just reading Baldwin's reactions to gender over time just kind of shows you that radicals, revolutionaries, people of political prominence can be so revered, but we all have gaps. We all have things that we aren't as versed on, that we could be better on. And I do think it's important to understand the specifics of this and to understand how it showed up in conversations with people in his life, because what these kind of readings and conversations make me think of is how did Baldwin engage with women in his world and his life? How did he understand and relate to feminism? How did he defend women or Black women around him? Or was that a justification or politic that he felt was necessary? Or was it a priority to care for men, to want men around, to understand the plight of men because he was a man? Where is the line between caring for your people and your background and wanting to humanize them versus permitting the violence they enact because you see it as justifiable in terms of it being misplaced but justifiable? It's very confusing. So next I want to present another perspective on Baldwin, this time from a Black queer man. His name is Joseph Beam. He wrote an essay titled James Baldwin, Not a Bad Legacy, Bruh. Then again, there are writers who offer concepts to ponder and rhetoricians who give us that akimbo warrior stance and a slogan to wail. Baldwin wrote with delicacy we've come to expect from women writers, yet at times his male figures could be as misogynist and despicable as those of any male writer. I would have wished Baldwin to have been more pro-feminist. In a dialogue with Black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde, which appeared several years ago in Essence, he spoke with less surety than Lorde about the mission of Black writers. Lorde clearly saw other Black women as her audience and issues of concerns to Black women as her primary subject matter. She pressed Baldwin, what do you have to say about the sexual violence of Black men in the Black community? Shouldn't you be talking about that? What are you saying to my son Jonathan? Lorde continued. And then it goes on to say, the crisis in Black male fiction, its lack of emotion and possibility, results from focusing on the racist foot on our necks. But life goes on. And I'm so glad that Joseph Beam writes this because it's important to look at perspectives that precede Baldwin, that give some critiques and show that people within his lifetime that admired him wanted more from him. I have my own very distinctive experience in relationship to gender. I grew up with two parents, and then my stepfather was eventually incarcerated, and then I started realizing that I was queer, and I was exposed to the anti-Blackness of growing up in a Caribbean family. I grew up with all these rules about masculinity, and then once my queerness came into play, I realized, oh, I'm a failure at being a man. And in some ways that's fine with me, but I need to negotiate how I survive and live in a world that tells me that I'm a failure and will enact violence onto me. And so I think from a very early age, the homophobia I experienced and kind of the misogyny, which I think is mixed in with homophobia, gave me some of the basic understandings of why femininity isn't bad, why womanhood isn't bad, and how it is something that I think should be understood, should be articulated, should be defended by men of all levels and backgrounds. Is that I'm disgusted by his perspectives on domestic violence as someone who is the child product of a relationship that involved domestic violence. And I deviate from this desire for heterocentrism because of my commitment to the possibilities of queerness, to my commitment to the possibilities of queerness to confront trauma, to bring community together, to bring people together across gendered boundaries, and to allow us to look clearly at each other and to understand what has been wrong, what things we've survived, and why it matters that we come together. And I think being the product or the aftermath of a domestic violence relationship, it really made me aware of how easy it is for men to permit violence because it benefits them on some level, whether it is an emotional catharsis, whether it is an expression of their rage to be validated by other men, is a transactional force that men use. And I think what Baldwin is gravely mistaken about is that he sees violence as this cathartic thing that Black men and women can kind of just heal through, but he doesn't articulate a process of healing through it. He doesn't articulate a process of holding men accountable. He says, this is irrational, but this is just the way it is, baby. You gotta beat your grandmother. And I'm like, that is not a structural solution. It is a solution based on your own comfort and your status quo in the world that you live in as a man that wants to align yourself with other men on some level because they've pushed you out. And what I say to Baldwin is like, you don't need to act like these other niggas out here. I mean, you could be your own kind of nigga. You don't gotta. I'm sure Baldwin has been exposed to it, but for me, it's much more material because I've had to process my own relation to it. The solution or the way out is much more necessary for Black women because they are subjected to more and more violence, being at the bottom, being exposed to misogynoir, being exposed to racism. And it becomes necessary for people like Nikki Giovanni or Audre Lorde or Fannie Lou Hamer or Rosa Parks or so many women of the movement to confront these violences because they are subjected to it and Black men benefit from it. If you read the works of Elaine Brown or Assata Shakur or Angela Davis, you can see traces of misogyny and misogynoir throughout all of their experiences. And so if we look at all of these experiences of Black women throughout this time period and onward, because it's not like misogynoir or patriarchy has faded away, what does it say that Black men consistently will align with powers or institutions or ideologies that subject Black women to violence? And how have these trends or ideas or perspectives on Black gender politics changed today? Black fat people, Black trans people writing about how not only does Blackness and gender play into the ways that we exist and operate in the world and experience violence, but so does our body type, so does our ability level, so does our specific gender expression, so does our class ranking. And I just hope that these discussions get deeper and deeper and we gain a logic of liberation that includes everyone and doesn't just excuse the violence that especially the more marginalized in a community experience. Thank you for watching another video and let me know what else you want to learn about Baldwin.